Night of Sin. The night air in suburban Los Angeles was thick with a stillness that promised peace. A welcome respite for the Tran family. In their modest but well-kept home, 12-year-old Emily Tran finished her homework at the kitchen table while her mother, Mai, busied herself preparing a late dinner. The distant hum of television laughter drifted in from the living room. Her father, David, a hardworking accountant with a gentle disposition, double-checked the next day's documents as he sipped green tea. Their life was quiet and ordinary, defined by routine and tempered by both love and the invisible pressure of living as an immigrant family, striving to fit in. Subtle reminders of their difference, the offhand comments at school, the wary glances at the grocery store, had grown so familiar that Emily barely noticed them anymore. For tonight, at least, the world outside their windows felt far away and mostly harmless, until the sharp knock at the door. In the span of seconds, the Tran family's world unraveled. Past midnight, the heavy beating on the door sent kitchen utensils tumbling. David, perplexed and already on edge from a stressful week at work, went to answer. The sight that greeted him, uniformed police officers with grim faces and cold, official voices. They announced they had a warrant for his arrest, charges of embezzlement and first-degree murder. Mai gasped desperately, demanding answers as the officers recited their rights and handcuffed David with an almost rehearsed efficiency. Emily, paralyzed by fear, peeked from behind the kitchen doorway, wide-eyed and shivering, unable to process the chaos erupting around her. Neighbors' windows blinked awake. Police radios crackled a cacophony in the sharp silence. The officers moved with mechanical indifference, ignoring Mai's pleas for compassion, for an explanation, for someone, anyone, to pause and realize the mistake they were making. David's voice wavered as he tried to assure his wife and daughter, but his words dissolved into the harsh commands of law enforcement. He was let out, blinking against the dizzying swarm of floodlights. Reporters already gathering, as though expecting a spectacle. Flashbulbs captured his bewildered expression, branding it on the front page before dawn. Inside, the small home was transformed into a battlefield of loneliness. All that remained in the doorway was a single slipper, hastily left behind in the struggle. Mai fell to her knees, her sobs echoing through the dark, empty house. Raw, animalistic, and utterly helpless. Emily pressed herself against the wall, hands over her ears, disbelief and terror swarming in her chest. The security of her world, so painstakingly nurtured by parental love, shattered with the click of the handcuffs. As night stretched into hesitant morning, Emily sat awake, tracing the memory of her father's silhouette against the flashing lights. The final sound before sleep claimed her was her mother's quiet, prayer-like whimper, a plea to a God who suddenly felt distant, if present at all. But peace would not return to the Tran household, and the first rays of dawn brought not hope, but the shadow of suspicion, scandal, and irreparable loss that would haunt Emily for years to come. Collapse of faith. The days that followed David Tran's arrest blurred into a relentless distortion of reality for both Mai and Emily. Each sunrise arrived not with renewal, but with a fresh stab of dread, as the outside world closed in around the battered core of what was left of their family. The news spread with merciless speed, morphing from whispered gossip into screaming headlines. By morning, images of David's stunned face graced every local paper. His name became a trending topic on social media, and television anchors debated his presumed guilt with the cold detachment of outsiders hungering for spectacle. To their neighbors, the Tran's tidy home now looked less like a refuge and more like the epicenter of sordid drama. Familiar faces avoided eye contact, and the once friendly chatter dried up into silence, broken only by the low murmur of barely veiled judgment. Mai, once the family's wellspring of calm, was the first to buckle under the weight of innuendo and public shaming. She found herself bombarded with invasive questions from reporters who flocked to their door, demanding statements she was neither able nor willing to give. Longtime friends, a handful of whom had shared potlucks and birthdays under her roof, suddenly claimed to be too busy to visit or answer her calls. Instead, their sympathy curdled into polite distance, and then into avoidance. At first, Mai threw herself into her routines with a frantic energy, as if ritual could anchor her in a reality she recognized. She scrubbed the kitchen counters with raw hands, wiped away invisible stains, and attempted, futilely, to preserve the rhythm of Emily's school life. But the world had shifted. Emily's teachers spoke to her in patronizing tones, and her classmates gazed at her with suspicion camouflaged as pity. Hallways became obstacle courses. Her name became a punchline whispered behind backs. Meanwhile, the investigation moved with merciless efficiency. Prosecutors spun a narrative of cold-blooded calculation, building their case on a mountain of circumstantial evidence. Financial records allegedly proved David's guilt, though the documents presented in court seemed jarringly unfamiliar to Mai and Emily. A single fingerprint, whose legitimacy no one in their circle understood enough to challenge, was paraded as incontrovertible proof. There were no moments of grace or listening, a relentless pursuit of a conviction that fit the city's desire for answers. Through endless nights filled with the buzz of television reporters and the distant sirens that now set Emily's teeth on edge, Mai's strength evaporated. She stopped cooking, then stopped eating altogether. Her eyes, once bright with defiant optimism, glazed over. She withdrew into herself, cycling through grief and numbness, haunted by doubts that gnawed at her faith in the world and in her husband's presumed innocence. With each passing day, isolation deepened, and the delicate threads holding mother and daughter together frayed under the strain. Emily watched all this helplessly, young, confused, and embittered by the world's refusal to grant them mercy. She tried to reach for her mother with words, with small gestures, but the chasm between them grew insurmountable. One night, the silence in the house became suffocating. Emily found Mai listless by the window, eyes fixed on nothing, whispering apologies to a husband she could neither save nor properly say goodbye to. It was in the dead of a moonless night that Mai, racked by guilt and shame, made the decision that would leave Emily truly alone. Her death came quietly, its discovery, like the rest of their ordeal, orchestrated more by cruel fate than by warning signs Emily, still a child, could ever have read. In the days after, Emily barely spoke. Social workers, officers, and well-meaning acquaintances came and went, their words bouncing off the walls of grief that now enclosed her. The Tran family name was spoken in somber, weighty tones, loaded with scandal and pity. The only remnants of faith in family, justice, or the American dream, lay in ruins. For Emily, the collapse of trust and comfort was total, a psychic wound for which there were no quick remedies, only an ache that made clear the world had split sharply into before and after. Stepping into the shadows, Emily Tran moved through the following months as if underwater, each motion weighty, every sound muffled by the invisible shroud of trauma. After her mother's funeral, the system moved in quickly, more efficient than comforting. With no immediate family willing or able to take her in, she found herself uprooted from the last place that felt like home and dropped into the care of strangers. The foster home was a small, crowded apartment in a low-income neighborhood, presided over by a weary couple already overwhelmed by 3 other foster kids. Here, Emily became a ghost in her own life. The walls, once colored by her mother's bright laughter and her father's gentle encouragement, now offered no solace. Meals were silent affairs, perfunctory and tense. The couple enforced rules with tired resignation, and the other children, each battling their own losses, viewed Emily with indifference, if not suspicion. For the first time, she learned the real meaning of solitude, not an absence of people, but a total lack of connection. School, which had once been a source of routine, was now a minefield. Her peers avoided her or gossiped behind her back, whispering about the girl whose father was a murderer and whose mother had lost her mind. Teachers alternated between overcompensating with forced sympathy and outright ignoring her presence. Emily quickly realized that drawing attention to herself only bred more cruelty. She became practiced at silence, neat at vanishing into the background, doing just enough to avoid intervention, but never enough to be noticed. The world outside offered little respite. Every news headline about crime, every half-joking jab about those people, every suspicious glance at her Asian features brought fresh reminders of her isolation. The foster system itself was impersonal. Caseworkers rotated through her file, but offered only procedural concern. Therapists asked her leading questions and praised her for shallow progress, never understanding the depths of her pain or the storm of anger buried beneath her outward reserve. In this new reality, Emily learned to hide every emotion. She buried her grief deep inside, locking it away where no one, least of all herself, could reach. Instead, she focused her energy on observation. For hours, she traced the events leading to her father's arrest, replaying every detail she could recall. Too young to understand the intricacies of law, yet too smart to accept what she'd been told, Emily started questioning the official story. She pored over clippings she'd hidden in her backpack, a stack of papers rescued from the trash by her mother after the media deluge, and noticed inconsistencies, a timeline that didn't quite match, a witness whose story changed with each retelling, details that seemed almost too convenient. The more she noticed, the colder and more calculating she became. She stopped crying on her birthday, stopped acknowledging the anniversaries of her parents' deaths. Emily replaced memories with resolve, letting determination fill the space grief had left behind. She read obsessively, seeking escape in detective novels, in stories about justice won against all odds. Late at night, when the others slept, Emily would stare at the ceiling and whisper silent promises to her parents, not of forgiveness, but of retribution. In truth, slowly, she changed. The awkward, frightened child faded, giving way to a young woman with sharp eyes and a heart armored against disappointment. She kept her grades impeccable, realizing that academic success was both her only defense and her best weapon. She listened rather than spoke and learned to blend in, watching everyone and trusting no one. The world had made her an outsider, and she accepted that role with a clarity far beyond her years. One by one, the bridges to her old life burned away. No one from her parents' circle reached out. Old acquaintances avoided her at church and in the grocery store. The last relics of family, photographs, worn clothes, her father's books, were boxed up and given away. Their absence in her new room, a constant silent wound. All that remained was a simmering determination to uncover the truth, a mission she clung to even when hope itself seemed reckless. By the end of that dark year, Emily Tran was changed. She had stepped fully into the shadows, not because the world had abandoned her, but because she had chosen to survive on her own terms. From those shadows, she began to watch and to wait, poised for a fight she could neither name nor escape. Blood on the witness stand. By the time Emily Tran entered adulthood, any lingering semblance of childhood innocence had long since been burned away. She became a model student, her grades immaculate, her record spotless, a quiet, methodical girl whose reputation rested on predictability and discipline. Yet beneath the surface, her mind churned with questions, and her heart remained haunted by the violence that had shattered her family. College was her first true escape. She earned a scholarship to a respected state university and chose criminal justice as her field, bewildering some advisors, but not herself. In classrooms, she absorbed with clinical precision every case law, every debate on evidence, every nuance of constitutional rights and police procedure. She learned the history of exonerations and wrongful convictions, and she memorized the flaws of the American legal system, not as academic topics, but as weapons for her future. Still, Emily remained an outsider. She rarely partied or joined study groups. Her friendships were surface level, and her routine always included solitary late-night study in the law library. She seemed to glide through the world invisible, leaving no traces, just as she had trained herself in foster care. But this invisibility was her ally. It allowed her to watch and listen and gather information unnoticed. One brick at a time, Emily constructed a plan. The time had come, she decided, to rip open the wounds of justice that had been so crudely stitched shut years before. The first step was obtaining access to the old case files, court transcripts, police reports, forensic analyses, and witness statements. While most records were technically public, certain documents were sealed or redacted, requiring clever maneuvering. Leveraging her student credentials and claiming a research interest in wrongful convictions, Emily contacted the county records office. She waited in a sterile hallway lined with battered chairs and worn linoleum in the same courthouse where her father's fate had been sealed. The records clerk, a soft-spoken woman in her 50s, barely glanced up as she slid a heavy manila envelope of scanned documents across the counter. "Some of it's missing," the clerk said, shrugging with bureaucratic resignation. "That's all there is on file." Emily nodded, thanked her, and concealed her trembling hands as she left. Alone in her dorm room, she pored over the hundreds of pages late into the night, noting every inconsistency and unwarranted omission. The discovered holes were as damning as any concrete evidence. Lab reports, referenced in the trial, but not included, forensic notes whose pages ended mid-sentence, an unsigned witness affidavit. She scribbled timelines on yellow legal pads until her vision blurred. The names of detectives and prosecutors recurred: Vincent Grady, lead investigator; Patricia Monroe, assistant district attorney; Dr. Harold Watts, forensic analyst. Their signatures became warning calls, for Emily was no longer a child, and she trusted her instincts over any official narrative. She paid silent visits to the neighborhood where she once lived, observing from a distance how some old faces had aged with comfort, others with guilt. She dressed in nondescript clothing and kept her hair tied back in a severe knot. She trailed Vincent Grady to the donut shop he still frequented every Tuesday, watched Patricia Monroe slipped between courthouse security and glossy black sedans, and saw Dr. Watts giving lectures at a local college. She logged their routines, their habits, their links, but the case file itself was only one piece of a fractured puzzle. Emily knew that the key evidence at her father's trial had hinged on a single, bloody fingerprint found at the crime scene, the murder for which he was accused. She scoured the published testimony, the forensic charts, and realized the chain of custody for this fingerprint had never been thoroughly established. A loan technician, whose name was buried in a footnote, had processed the print and then left the police department only weeks after submitting his report. Emily made note of this, her resolve hardening. With dogged persistence, Emily reached out, first impersonally, then directly. She began emailing old defense attorneys, cloaking her motivations in language academic enough to avoid suspicion. She cold-called Dr. Watts and requested an informational interview, pretending to be a graduate student fascinated by his career. He accepted, distracted by flattery and unbothered by paperwork from 2 decades ago. Their conversation was polite, but when Emily steered the discussion to old fingerprinting techniques and questioned discrepancies in sample handling, she noticed a flicker of annoyance in the professor's eyes. He deflected. Emily thanked him. Her suspicions sharpened. Her next target was an officer who had testified for the prosecution. Now retired, he lived alone and spent his mornings tending roses in a modest suburb. Emily posed as a law student working on an oral history project, recording their chat in the sunlight of his porch. Flashing her small, well-rehearsed smile, she coaxed from him tales of department politics and shortcuts in tight budget years. From the margins of those stories, she gleaned a quiet admission. Evidence sometimes went missing or got helped along for the sake of expediency and convictions. Frustrated and fascinated, Emily turned to the technical backbone of the case, the digital trail. She used legal routes, piecing together public record requests with freedom of information, act filings to reconstruct old emails, and chain of custody logs from the lab. ET responses trickled in, redacted and incomplete, but she pieced together enough to see that the technician responsible for the bloody fingerprint, Michael Swinton, had raised a concern by email about a contaminated sample just before leaving the force. That memo had been downplayed and buried. Emily realized then that she needed allies, people immune to the small-town cronyism that still infected the legal system. By now, she was in her 3rd year, impressive enough to have attracted the attention of certain professors. She approached Dr. Emma Rollins, a newly tenured expert in forensic justice and a prominent advocate for the Innocence Project, cautiously revealing her family's history under the protection of confidentiality. Dr. Rollins agreed to help, moved by the raw outline of Emily's plight and intrigued by the material Emily had gathered. Together, they mapped out a strategy: interview additional witnesses, compare trial transcripts, probe the district attorney's case, construction for logical gaps. They assembled files in a private office, poring over details late into the night. Dr. Rollins connected Emily to a private investigator who had formerly helped exonerate other wrongfully accused clients. He lent his expertise, tracing former police officers and finding contractors involved in the original crime scene cleanup. The deeper the group dug, the more cracks they unearthed, evidence that had never been logged, a witness who was pressured to alter their statement, a grainy piece of security footage lost in transport. Each new discovery sent a jolt of emotion through Emily. First, the old anger and grief, then a cold, methodical sense of purpose. For Emily, Visiting the courthouse again to review witness depositions was more than a research project. It felt like descending into a tomb, the air inside heavy with the echoes of her father's trial. She stared at the judge's bench, at the harsh geometry of wooden pews, where, as a child, she'd sat clutching her mother's trembling hand. Now she walked those halls alone, her spine straight, her eyes hard. She would not be dismissed or pitied. A turning point came when, by presenting herself as a research student, she obtained a sealed copy of the evidence inventory log from a sympathetic clerk. Here, in faded black ink, the chain of custody for the crucial fingerprint was exposed for what it truly was: broken, unsigned at a key exchange. The fingerprint had passed through 3 sets of hands without the proper witnessing. The implication was clear. Tampering was not only possible, it was likely. As the semester closed, Emily found herself standing outside the courthouse, beneath a bruised, anvil-gray sky. She stared at the old stone columns, her reflection barely visible in the shadowed glass. She knew the path forward would not be easy. She would have to confront the living, architects of her family's ruin, demand explanations, and when none were forthcoming, drag their secrets into the light. But for the first time in years, Emily felt something shift inside her, a tremor not of fear, but of hope, alloyed with vengeance. The system that had destroyed her family would soon be forced to answer for the blood it spilled on that witness stand. Emily, once a victim, now stood ready for war. Ghosts in the system. Emily Tran had always believed that evil in the justice system was like a current, broad yet impersonal. What she learned as she dug deeper was that corruption, when left unchecked, mutated into something spectral. Old sins lingering in shadows, infecting lives years after the crime scene tape was taken down. Armed with her evidence and strengthened by Dr. Rollins' guidance, Emily and her small, discreet team began building a new map, not of streets and addresses, but of connections. Like a chess player, Emily laid out the pieces. Patricia Monroe, the cutthroat district attorney, whose career had soared off the high-profile conviction. Vincent Grady, the grizzled detective, now a minor celebrity in law enforcement circles. Dr. Harold Watts, the forensic analyst whose testimony had sealed the jury's doubt. And, beneath the surface, a handful of shadowy names that had only surfaced in offhand remarks and buried memos. They started at the edges. Emily, who had mastered blending in, attended legal conferences and precinct open days under the guise of a curious student. She struck up conversations with junior lawyers over cheap coffee, gleaned gossip from janitors who remembered trial days, and developed a knack for listening without seeming to care. With Dr. Rollins' help, she scoured archives for promotion records, examining who had profited from David Tran's conviction and how quickly their fortunes had risen. Pattern after pattern emerged. Promotions that appeared out of nowhere. Bonuses distributed in years. Budget constraints should have made them impossible. Friendly handshakes at City Hall events froze into hostile silences whenever David Tran's case was mentioned. Emily took notes on every pause, every flicker of discomfort in conversation. Some of the ghosts were less abstract. Emily discovered that during her father's trial, Monroe had relied on the expert analysis of Dr. Watts, whose department received a sudden influx of research grants the following fiscal year. The money trail was crooked but persistent, running through shell consulting firms and city initiatives nobody at City Hall seemed able to explain. Every financial anomaly had a corresponding signature, always someone involved in her father's prosecution. Emily's search was not without conflict. Anonymous emails arrived in her inbox, sometimes cryptic, sometimes threatening. One told her to let the dead stay buried. Another reminded her that the law remembers. Dr. Rollins cautioned her to document everything and avoid being alone at night. But even fear couldn't halt Emily's resolve. The more resistance she met, the more convinced she became of the rot at the heart of the system. Her investigation soon spilled offline. With the help of the private investigator, Emily tailed Grady after dark, documenting his meetings with an unregistered security consultant, a man rumored to have once worked for the city's internal affairs office before being pressured into early retirement. Through grainy surveillance shots and painstaking license plate checks, they learned that several police officers who'd testified against her father were still meeting occasionally at a sleepy bar on the edge of town, a place where nobody asked questions, and the bartender never made eye contact. Realizing it was time for a light touch, Emily engineered accidental run-ins. She cornered the security consultant at a city forum and posed sharp questions under a friendly facade about chain of custody procedures. She noticed the sweat bead at his hairline and the way his eyes darted toward the exit. The man excused himself quickly. Later, she found a torn piece of notepaper stuffed into her messenger bag. On it, in shaky handwriting, were 3 dates and a warning. Follow the funding. That's where they hid everything. Puzzle pieces began to fall into place. The 3 dates matched the transfer of evidence logs between the police lab, the district attorney's office, and city storage. On each, an internal memo was signed off by a city manager who'd abruptly resigned a month after David's guilty verdict. Emily's research into the manager's post-resignation career led to a consultancy firm, one that had helped Monroe draft grant applications for the prosecutor's office the next year. Perhaps most chilling to Emily was the realization that official records had been deliberately altered. With Dr. Rollins' connections, she scanned court microfiche and digital archives and compared sworn affidavits. Some contained identical text, but in a handful, the signatures had been scanned and embedded, not inked. The implication was grave. Evidence had not only been mishandled, it had possibly never physically existed as it was presented. Someone had manipulated the documents themselves. Each confrontation she staged became riskier. Once, when Emily pressed a mid-level officer, he laughed at her and called her that ghost girl from the Tran case. But behind the bravado, his hands quivered. He agreed to meet her in a parking lot after dusk. But when Emily arrived, he never showed. Later that evening, someone threw a brick through Dr. Rollins' office window. No note, just a silent warning. Despite the threats, Emily pressed on. Using encrypted accounts, she leaked queries about the fingerprint technician, Michael Swinton, to investigative journalists. She scoured property records and intercepted whispers about a whistleblower buried by departmental policy. When she found Swinton living under a different name in a coastal town, she tracked him down and approached him at a diner. Over cheap black coffee, Swinton confessed how he'd once tried to report contamination in the fingerprint sample and was silenced with a severance check and veiled threats about his sick mother's health care. Exposure was slow, but it was growing. Journalists started digging into old police budgets. A city councilman quietly reached out asking for details. Emily realized her investigation had moved from shadows to the attention of those with real power and enemies. Haunted by exhaustion, Emily sometimes wondered if the struggle was worth it. But each night, as she stared at her father's faded trial photo taped above her desk, she remembered that the ghosts in the system could only terrify those who refused to call them by name. She would not flinch. Her work was no longer only about justice for her family. It was about exposing the entirety of a network that had preyed on the powerless for years. One rainy afternoon, she received a battered envelope in her campus mailbox. No return address. Inside were redacted police files and a sticky note. This is only the beginning. Emily felt a cold thrill race up her spine. For the first time, she sensed the system itself was unsettled, spooked, even, by what she had unearthed. Through a patchwork of alliances and subterfuge, Emily's attack on the system had begun. Systematic, relentless. She forced those in positions of comfort to shift in their chairs and remember what it felt like to be watched. For the first time in years, the ghosts in the system found themselves haunted, not by the past, but by the daughter of the man they'd destroyed. And Emily, driven by truth and the specters of memory, was far from finished. The price of pain. Emily Tran no longer recognized the girl in the cracked bathroom mirror of her tight, off-campus apartment. The reverberations of battle, years spent picking apart police reports, dodging threats, and uncovering secrets, had hardened her. Each new piece of evidence extracted from the system was bitter water, necessary, but never quenching her thirst for justice. With every revelation, she felt herself moving further from the person her parents once hoped she would become. Still, she pressed on, compelled by grief and a wrath that refused to fade. She'd learned that the pursuit of truth was rarely linear. Sometimes it meant lying, pretending affection, or feeding egos to extract confessions. Emily built her strategy quietly, keeping even Dr. Rollins in the dark about certain moves when necessary. She tracked former officers, prosecutors, and clerks, anyone who had a hand in her father's fall. Some had moved states or changed careers, but Emily had become a master of digital footprints and public records. She frequented late-night diners and union bars, blending into the background and listening. She learned who was most desperate to protect their reputations and who was already haunted. A former forensic assistant became her first coup. Timothy Michaels, now a stressed-out IT consultant with fading ambitions, had once helped process evidence for the city. After weeks of anonymous online messages and a single, carefully planned, in-person confrontation, Emily cornered him in a subway station. She recited details only an insider would know. Shifts, report numbers, the color of a forgotten lanyard. Timothy crumbled faster than she anticipated. Between trembling hands and darting eyes, he admitted to witnessing irregularities during her father's trial. Currency exchanged in unmarked envelopes, instructions to fix discrepancies before court deadlines, evidence locked away without second reviews. Emily recorded the conversation, later converting it into a transcript that she shared only with Dr. Rollins and a trusted journalist. In the press, the first cracks appeared in the supposedly impeccable record of the veteran detective whose testimony had sunk her father. The revelations created a fissure in public confidence and sent those involved scrambling. Behind closed doors, city officials organized damage control meetings and quietly severed ties with problematic former employees. This was just the beginning. A former district attorney, facing down rumors that could derail a political campaign, publicly denounced any irregularities as the work of individual bad actors. The public watched, hungry for spectacle, as local talk shows dissected the city's legacy of law enforcement missteps. For Emily, this was progress, but it tasted sour. Justice for her family wasn't only facts brought to light, but the pain paid by those who profited from their suffering. Each victory, came at a personal cost. Emily's emotional state frayed at the edges. Her nights were restless, plagued by dreams in which her mother wept quietly in empty courtrooms and her father faded into faceless crowds. She stopped answering texts from friends. Some days, she forgot to eat. The pursuit of retribution was consuming her, but she couldn't stop. It was the only thing tethering her to purpose. Some of those she exposed fell hard. The police detective who'd orchestrated witness intimidation resigned in disgrace as evidence from Emily's files forced a city inquiry. The university where Dr. Watts had built his post-scandal career cut ties with him after media pressure mounted. Each time a name was added to her mental tally of the condemned, Emily waited for satisfaction, but only exhaustion grew. But there was worse pain in discovering darkness in unexpected places. As Emily's investigation gained notoriety, she uncovered betrayal not just among the powerful, but within her own shrinking network. A former family friend, someone who had laughed in her kitchen as a child, who had hugged her at her parents' funerals, was revealed to have acted as a confidential informant during her father's prosecution. The man, Mr. Chen, had been bribed in quiet installments to corroborate the story police needed. Emily found proof in financial transactions and emails, and when she confronted him, his denials wilted into confession. That confrontation marked a breaking point. The sense of violation was raw. Betrayal tasted sharper than rage ever had. Emily wondered, for the first time, whether her quest had turned her heart to stone. The system had done its cruelty, but so had the ordinary people who sold out their neighbors for convenience or survival. Her pain became more complicated. No longer a single note of righteous anger, but a cacophony of loss, bitterness, and doubt. Dr. Rollins urged caution, believing Emily's obsession was endangering her health and sanity. But the world seemed to demand a price for every step forward. Anonymous threats followed her, increasing in both frequency and menace. Her apartment door was graffitied, her email flooded with hate. She received, one chilling morning, a blood-red envelope containing a single phrase, "Your family's pain isn't done yet." Even so, she pressed on, numb to personal cost. Soon, her work began affecting those around her. Dr. Rollins' office was vandalized a second time, the windows smashed and files scattered. Journalists she worked with endured legal threats. When Emily discovered a hidden camera planted outside her apartment, she realized that pain was not limited to those who'd earned it. It spread like poison. It was during these darkest days that Emily, sleepless and spent, gained her greatest weapon, perspective. While loss and rage had driven her for years, the mounting collateral damage forced her to weigh her choices. Was the destruction of her enemies worth becoming unrecognizable to herself, to the memory of her parents? Could vengeance ever sate the wound left in innocence's place? Her answer, at first, was simply to push forward. But one night, on a nearly deserted public bus, Emily broke down. The city's lights blurred through the rain. She wept, openly for the first time in years, clutching the last photo of her family, the before, the unbroken. In her tears, she found a glimmer of resolve, a promise not just to avenge the past, but to choose a future for herself. From that point, Emily's tactics shifted subtly. She remained relentless, but she allowed herself moments of vulnerability with Dr. Rollins, confiding fears as well as strategies. She sought out other survivors, children whose parents had faced wrongful accusations, mothers who'd lost everything to system failures. Together, they discussed not only pain, but also healing, the possibility of justice made whole. Emily realized that the true price of pain wasn't measured only in the suffering of one's enemies, but in what she surrendered of herself in the process. Still, she carried her burden, and for the system that created it, she became something unstoppable. Not just a wounded child hunting justice, but a force determined to ensure that pain would be repaid in full. Facing the past, the city's autumn brought a sullen chill, winding between glass towers and tired strip malls, settling deep into Emily Tran's bones. She had become both hunter and hunted, shadow and sentinel, walking streets haunted by memory and consequence. After years spent unraveling the knots of her family's destruction, she understood the steep cost of her quest, but the time for doubt was long past. Now, as the system recoiled from her revelations and enemies closed ranks, Emily prepared to confront the final ghosts head-on, even if it meant risking everything. The city's bureaucracy stirred and rumbled, flushed by the light Emily and her allies had thrown on the case. Internal affairs opened long, cold inquiries. Newspapers, emboldened by her evidence, published exposés on evidence tampering and political backscratching. It would have been triumphant if not for the paranoia seeping through every phone call and public encounter. Emily's life, once numb with routine, now burned with danger. Once, she had been content with strategy from afar, encrypted messages, deep dives into archive files, quiet confrontations in forgotten cafes. Now, everything was urgent and raw. Surveillance trailed her in nondescript cars, her inbox filled with both offers of support and anonymous threats, warning her to end this before it ends you. Even Dr. Rollins grew anxious, keeping a baseball bat close, never walking home alone. Fear, which had once paralyzed Emily, now sharpened her senses. Her primary adversaries, the prosecutor Monroe, the detective Grady, and others who had built their careers on her father's ruin, had grown nervous, some hiring lawyers, others fleeing town for vacation, or suddenly retiring. But the rot ran deeper. Beneath these public figures lay a web of go-betweens, enablers, and, more painfully, betrayals that bit into Emily's heart. Emily's investigation reached a new intensity. She needed more than evidence. She needed confessions, the irrefutable proof of hands dirtied and consciences ignored. This meant getting closer than ever before to people who wanted her gone. She changed her routines daily, used burner phones, and stopped speaking openly in public. But she refused to be driven underground. Instead, Emily brought the fight to her adversaries' doorsteps. She began with those who had once seemed harmless: the minor clerks, the legal assistants, a janitor who had just done his job during her father's trial. She visited them in their new neighborhoods, on commuter trains, and in anonymous corners of coffee shops, showing them fragments of what she'd uncovered. Some broke down in tears, confessing the little manipulations they'd enabled under orders. Others clammed up, terrified that any alliance with Emily would doom them. She heard stories of files that had vanished, of evidence boxes suspiciously light, of sidebar conversations ending with envelopes changing hands. But Emily's deepest test arrived with an even older tie, Mr. Vin Nguyen, a man who had once been her father's closest friend, her childhood's Uncle Vin, who'd carried gifts at Lunar New Year and comforted Mai after David's arrest. Over time, Emily discovered that Vin had played both sides, relaying rumors to police, and later providing testimony that, though seemingly innocuous, helped nudge the case toward her father's conviction. The evidence had been there in scraps of city payroll records and cryptic emails, payments approved to community liaisons for consulting. The realization gutted her. Betrayal was not distant or abstract, but personal. Emily agonized for days before confronting him. She arranged to meet at a small park where city noise receded into the hush of rustling leaves. Vin arrived, older, slower, but guarded. For a moment, they were just the girl and the uncle who'd once made her laugh. But Emily couldn't indulge nostalgia. She showed him her evidence, asked her questions plainly. He denied what he could, until at last he broke, his voice trembling, hands stuffed deep in his jacket, as he confessed how the police had threatened to derail his business license if he didn't cooperate, how he'd convinced himself he was protecting his own family. "You were like a daughter," he whispered, tears shining in his eyes. "But I was afraid." Emily heard the regret, but couldn't find forgiveness. Not yet. Instead, she extracted his sworn statement and walked away, hollowed but resolute. Other confrontations followed. A former paralegal who admitted to forging initials on the chain of custody document, a news editor who acknowledged why certain tips had been buried, preserving the official story to curry favor with City Hall. Emily's list of collaborators grew longer than she'd ever dared imagine. Every conversation left her raw, but each truth was a brick in the new foundation she was building for her father's name and for herself. The fight took a physical toll. Emily's hands trembled when she typed. Her sleep was honeycombed by nightmares, memories melding with faces of the adults who'd failed her family. Dr. Rollins watched with increasing concern, warning her about burnout. But Emily wouldn't slow down. "I have to see this through," she said, again and again, as if compelled by a prophecy only she could see. If there was solace, it was in the growing chorus of voices. Other families, former friends of her parents, community activists, who began stepping forward. Some had stories of loved ones trapped by the same system. Others simply offered meals or kind words. The solidarity did not ease the burden. But for the first time, Emily felt the possibility that she was not alone. The opposition escalated. Monroe's lawyers issued cease and desist letters. Detective Grady held a press conference, painting Emily as unstable and obsessed. An anonymous figure tried hacking Emily's emails, flooding her social media with threats and doxing her address. Through it all, Emily grew cautious, but refused to cower. Each assault only convinced her that she was close, dangerously close, to the truth. Still, the hardest moments were personal. She would sit at her kitchen table in the pre-dawn darkness, rereading her mother's old recipes, David's scrawled notes in the margins of legal pads. She remembered laughter, hugs, the sharp tang of star fruit in childhood summers. Things lost, yet not entirely erased. Each memory sharpened her will, transforming grief into fuel for the days ahead. As winter crept in, Emily knew the time had come for public testimony, armed with affidavits, recordings, correspondence, and a mountain of cross-referenced evidence. She requested a meeting with the district attorney's office and internal affairs. She demanded a hearing, not just for her family, but for everyone harmed by these ghosts in the system. The date was set. News cameras would be there. The stakes were higher than ever. On the eve of her testimony, Emily stood beneath the city's cold skyline. She remembered her parents, their sacrifices and love, and the promise she'd made to herself, not only to unearth the truth, but to reclaim meaning, her own and her family's. She no longer longed for revenge alone. She wanted transformation, something more than pain and punishment. As the dawn broke, Emily breathed in the cold air, ready at last to lay her family's pain and the city's secrets before the world. No matter what the outcome, she would no longer be defined by tragedy. She had faced the past, and now she stepped forward, determined to shape the future with her own hands. Justice or revenge, the truth was now a blade unsheathed, its edge sharp enough to cut through years of lies. Emily Tran stood at the center of a battle she had never asked for, but had chosen to fight to the bitter end. The months leading up to her testimony had stripped away every last comfort, exposing her to the glare of a public thirsty for both spectacle and closure. She knew that her next choices would shape not just her future, but the meaning of her family's suffering. On the morning of the hearing, City Hall was swarming, a hive of anxious officials, fidgeting reporters, and distant, silent protesters, holding hand-printed signs that read, "Justice for the innocent," and "Accountability now." Emily entered through the side door, escorted by 2 officers who had been briefed about the threats against her life. Her palms were slick with sweat, her jaw tight. Behind the barricades, strangers watched with hungry eyes, curious whether the headlines of corruption and conspiracy would finally give way to confessions and consequences. Inside, the grand chamber buzzed with nervous anticipation. The district attorney's office, now forced under a harsh new light, was crammed with lawyers. Vincent Grady's face loomed from a monitor. He had declined to appear in person, citing health issues. Patricia Monroe took her seat at the front, her previously unshakable composure fraying at the edges. Around the room, journalists whispered, pens poised. Emily took her place at the witness stand. Everything she had labored over, condensed into carefully assembled folders and digital files. The presiding judge, a woman with a reputation for integrity and an unblinking stare, called the proceedings to order. Emily's voice, hesitant at first, steadied as she began recounting the long arc of her father's case, the missing evidence, the manipulated reports, the harassment and threats, the buried whistleblowers. She produced sworn affidavits from people who had once dismissed her, former clerks, paralegals, even the longtime janitor, now willing to admit their small parts in a wider machinery of deception. Each confession was like a brick removed from the wall, protecting those in power. Emily presented financial records, marked with dates and signatures, cross-referenced emails, forensic analysis of altered documents, and the transcript of her meeting with Michael Swinton, the one technician who had risked everything to tell the truth. Bit by bit, the system that had destroyed her family was cracked open for everyone to see. The gallery was silent but electric, the tension rising with each damning revelation. Cameras panned to Monroe, who scribbled frantic notes and whispered to her counsel. The judge's gavel fell again and again, struggling to maintain order as outbursts erupted from accused parties in the crowd. As her testimony continued, Emily felt a strange numbness, pain and anger having burned away, replaced by a clarity she had not expected. She forced herself to focus on every detail, determined that there would be no loose ends, no escape hatches for those who had built their careers on her father's ruin. When the final document was entered into the record, Emily sat back, spine pressed straight against the hard wooden chair. She watched the reactions ripple through the room, the disbelief, the shock, the beginnings of shame. She knew it was not enough simply to expose secrets. She wanted to see accountability, but she also felt, in the pit of her stomach, a growing ache, the sense that nothing she could do would undo the years stolen from her father, the destruction of her mother, or the way the world had turned cold. As closing statements began, her adversaries made their moves. Monroe, voice taut but defiant, insisted that any wrongdoing was isolated. Bad apples in a field of honest public servants. Grady, via video link, attacked the credibility of every witness and framed his actions as mere zeal for justice. The room was divided. Some believed, some scoffed, others simply waited for the spectacle of downfall. That night, alone in her apartment, Emily stared at the city lights, hearing fragments of her own words ringing in her head. Dr. Rollins texted words of caution and support, reaffirming Emily's right to both anger and pursuit of justice. But Emily could not shake the sensation that the battle was not just legal or political, but moral, a matter of what kind of person she was choosing to become. The following days sent shockwaves through the city. News outlets replayed clips from the hearing. Commentators dissected Monroe's fall from grace, and angry citizens called for reforms. The district attorney's office was raided by state investigators. Grady was placed under formal review. Dr. Watts resigned from his university in disgrace, and others fled town, leaving only their signatures on years of secret deals. Then came the news from a prison in the state's remote interior. David Tran, Emily's father, had died a year before the evidence could exonerate him. The judge issued a public statement declaring David innocent in light of the new revelations. A legal redemption, cold comfort to a family shattered long ago. His name was cleared, but Emily's victory felt hollow, heavy with sorrow that no courtroom could heal. Meanwhile, the city's machinery of gossip and rage roared. Some demanded the maximum penalty for Monroe and her co-conspirators. Others blamed Emily herself, accusing her of stirring up unrest or seeking fame from her pain. At night, as she lay in bed, the question haunted her. Had she truly pursued justice or simply revenge? Would exposing these ghosts create a better world or just a new wound on the city's conscience? A week after the hearing, Monroe's legal team reached out in desperation, offering a plea bargain that would let Monroe avoid prison in exchange for testifying against other officials. Emily met with prosecutors, torn between the icy satisfaction of seeing Monroe punished and the pragmatic lure of wider justice. Rollins counseled her to consider the outcome that would stop future tragedies, not just avenge the past. Faced with the final decision, Emily stood in silence in the now empty courtroom. She thought about her mother's last prayers, her father's soft laugh, the girl she had once been, the girl who believed the world was fair. She realized that justice was not a simple thing. It was a constant negotiation between memory, loss, and hope. Vengeance had given her purpose, but it could not return what was lost. If she destroyed her enemies entirely, would she still recognize the person she became? In the end, Emily chose to accept the plea deal, not as a surrender, but as a reckoning. Monroe's testimony would put an end to a decade of silent corruption, and, Emily hoped, transform a broken system. The city would remember what had happened, but it could also begin the slow work of healing. As the courthouse emptied and the world rushed on. Outside, Emily allowed herself a moment of extraordinary quiet. The ghosts in the system had been named. Her father's record was clean. The pain remained, but so did the possibility of change. Emily left the courthouse not as a symbol of revenge, but as a survivor who had learned the cost of justice and its limits. For the first time, the future felt uncertain, but no longer impossible. Ashes of memory. A winter rain tapped gently on the window pane of Emily Tran's apartment, blurring the city lights into pale, watercolor streaks. Weeks had passed since the courthouse ordeal. The headlines now faded, the heated public debates giving way to other scandals and stories. It should have been closure, some kind of finality after years of struggle. But for Emily, the aftermath felt less like an ending than the slow cooling of embers, a time when both devastation and possibility lingered in the quiet. The legal outcome was clear. Her father's innocence publicly restored, her family salvaged from the gutter of public disgrace. For months, the Tran name had been uttered with pity or suspicion. Now, some neighbors offered shy greetings. Others quietly left offerings of fruit or flowers at her door. Emily accepted these gestures with a gratitude she didn't always feel. The hollow places in her life weren't so easily healed by the signatures of judges or the contrition of strangers. In the mornings, Emily busied herself with routine, as though sweeping up the last ashes of chaos. She still took the bus to her job at a community legal clinic, where she drafted letters, sorted intake files, and helped other families navigate the bureaucracy that nearly destroyed her own. In the quiet before dawn, she would sit alone with a mug of tea, tracing the ridges of an old photograph, her mother laughing in the kitchen, her father scribbling in the margins of a crossword puzzle. Emily herself, 10 years old and unafraid of the world. Sometimes she ached so fiercely it felt like a second heartbeat, one she learned to carry in silence. The pain had changed, grown less like a wound and more like a scar. Nightmares still haunted her, phantom echoes trailing her through dreams. A knock at the door, flashbulbs sparking, the loss echoing endlessly. But unlike before, the grief no longer ruled her. She could grieve and still move forward, could mourn without being shackled. The ghosts of her parents remained with her, but their presence was now a source of strength rather than only sorrow. Emily had always feared that the battle for justice would make her unrecognizable to herself. She had indeed changed. Her trust was slower to surface, her laughter rare and wary. Yet she was learning, day by day, to let herself hope again. In the clinic, a mother's grateful smile over a resolved landlord dispute, a teen's shy thank you after surviving the social services maze. These reminders anchored her, showing her that her pain could be alchemized into purpose. For others, sometimes the city itself seemed changed too, as if the exposure of the system's rot had forced it to confront its own conscience. The police department enacted new transparency protocols. Community boards drew larger crowds. Emily watched as teenagers organized rallies in city parks, demanding honest policing and fair representation. Kids who, maybe, had whispered about her years ago. Now, some of them approached her downtown, awkward but sincere, to thank her. She offered a nod and a small smile, remembering what it felt like to be invisible. But even as the world shifted, Emily confronted the ashes of memory in ways both vivid and subtle. One evening, she returned to their old neighborhood. The Tran family's former house belonged to someone else now. The rose bushes overgrown, the living room glowing blue from the flicker of a television. She stood across the street under a pale, meager street lamp and closed her eyes, letting the past rise up before her. The clatter of chopsticks at dinner, her mother humming while doing laundry, her father's stories of old Saigon. In this space, memories felt less like traps and more like a gentle tether, binding her to the love that endured beyond trauma. Inside her apartment, a cardboard box sat unopened in the corner, the last of her parents' belongings, retrieved from the city's storage locker after the verdict. Emily finally opened it one rain-soaked night, her hands trembling as she lifted each object out. Her mother's worn recipe book, her father's fountain pen, a stack of faded birthday cards. She wept freely, allowing herself not just sorrow, but gratitude, remembrance without regret. Letting go, she realized, didn't mean forgetting. It meant making peace with impermanence, deciding which stories to carry forward and which to lay to rest. Through therapy and her slow, difficult conversations with Dr. Rollins and with survivors of other injustices, Emily began to loosen her grip on vengeance, focusing instead on what justice truly required. Not just retribution, but the opportunity for healing and new beginnings. Opportunities, at last, began to appear. Dr. Rollins offered her a position as a research assistant, investigating patterns of wrongful convictions and helping reform city policy. Emily accepted, quietly proud. Her journey would never erase the past, but she could help make the future less cruel for others. She also reconnected with her childhood friend, Thao, who brought laughter and a patient ear. They walked city streets together, rain or shine, and Emily let herself imagine a life with space for joy again. Yet not everything was easy. There were days when shadows crept in, the weight of hate mail, the sting of gossip, the ache from old betrayals. At times, Emily's inner voice accused her of letting her family down, of bartering vengeance for peace. But she learned to answer those doubts with the truth that moving forward didn't mean abandoning the past, only refusing to live inside its ruins. She found comfort in simple rituals, cooking her mother's po recipe on Sundays, listening to her father's old jazz records while filling out grant paperwork. Sometimes, when the grief felt insurmountable, she wrote long letters to her parents she would never send, telling them of her days, her hopes, her small triumphs and setbacks. Writing unfolded her pain, transforming it from a wound into a kind of offering, one only she needed to read. As the one-year anniversary of the verdict approached, Emily stood at her parents' grave in the tranquil cemetery, a bouquet of tiger lilies in her arms. The wind was cold, the air clean. She stood for a long moment, letting her tears fall without shame. "I miss you," she whispered, voice steady. "But I'm living, not just surviving. Thank you for loving me into who I am." There, amidst the quiet, Emily understood. The ashes of memory could nourish new life if she allowed them. Justice was not the end of her story, nor was pain. The story would continue, shaped each day by choice and care. For the first time in so many years, Emily walked away with hope, flickering quietly in her heart. Fragile, yes, but real, and hers to keep.